Allie, welcome to Disabled and Proud. How are you today?
I'm very well, thank you. How are you, Brooke?
Yeah, I'm glad that we've managed to get here and get sorted. And like this morning is over, so that's good in my eyes.
Absolutely, onwards and upwards from here.
Exactly. I'm really looking forward to today. I think I'm going to learn a lot, as I do with every single one of my podcasts, but I think particularly I'm going to learn a lot more than what I usually would. So I'm really looking forward to this chat and what we're going to speak about.
Excellent. I'm very glad to hear that. I hope I don't disappoint.
So the first question that I like to ask every single guest is, how do you refer to your disability?
So I say that I am autistic. I will never say that I have autism because it's not something that you can separate from the person with it being a neurological disability. And I do identify as disabled. There are a fair number of autistic people you'll probably find who won't identify with that label and who prefer to either just use that they're autistic, or they'll say that they're neurodivergent, which I also use as well. But thinking about the kind of social model of disability, I would definitely identify with that.
I think what you said just then about how you can't separate autism from the person is actually very, very interesting, because I think a lot of people like to almost try and separate the two. Like on the one hand, you can have autism, but you don't follow necessarily the quote unquote like most common traits for autism, whatever that is. And I think it's so interesting that actually what you said is that you can't, because it's neurological.
Well, exactly. I think that, you know, we can't get too philosophical about what makes a person and souls and all this stuff. However, if we think about the fact that you know, your brain plays a very big role in that, and that your brain changes over time, and this in turn changes who you are as a person over time. The fact that being born autistic is due to a neurological difference, a difference in your brain, I feel like it's very difficult. A lot of people that I spoke to, I'm jumping ahead of myself here, but a lot of people I spoke to when I wrote my book and I interviewed for my book said that they found some of the questions I asked them difficult because they couldn't separate themselves from being autistic. And I definitely feel that way personally. I think I would not be able to tell you which aspects of myself and my personality and which aspects of myself are because I'm autistic, or a combination of the two.
Oh, that's so interesting for someone who obviously doesn't identify as having like any neurodivergence whatsoever. I always find it incredibly interesting to have these conversations, because the thought patterns and the way our brain works are different, and they are different because they're wired up different. And obviously when you talk to someone who thinks differently from you, I always find that fascinating, because it's obviously very different from my day-to-day.
Yes. Yeah.
And your day-to-day will be very different to my day-to-day. So I find this whole conversation incredibly interesting.
It's so true. And I think for me, especially like when I'm talking to friends or family members, or even just, you know, random people that I meet, and they're like, oh, that's really interesting, can you tell me more about that? There's always, as you mentioned when we first started recording, there's always a lot of misconceptions around it, and there's always a lot of understanding that's still needed. So I'm always really happy to have those conversations. But trying to explain how my day-to-day is different from other people's day-to-day can be challenging, because I don't know any different. I don't know what you're going through, and you don't know what I'm going through. So it's very difficult to meet in the middle and identify where those differences are.
Yeah, of course. And for you, obviously autism requires some form of diagnosis. And I was wondering, and this is only because I know that females being diagnosed with autism tends to come later on in life. It's not necessarily something you're diagnosed with as a child, because in everyone's brain, which is wrong, that the idea of autism is the naughty white boy in the class who's like throwing bricks at you. Like that is like the very stereotypical, oh, he's autistic model that everyone, if you don't necessarily fit into that mold, it's like, oh, you can't really have autism then. And I was wondering, because of, you know, you're a female, where was your diagnosis where was that process for you? How did it all happen for you?
Yeah, so I'm a classic late diagnosed female. We're just going to get a little dog's head in the corner there if she turns
Oh, we
herself
love
around.
that. We love that. Welcome.
She's like, I will make my appearance in this podcast, whether you want me to or not. Yeah, so my diagnosis didn't come until I was 23, and it happened just before the pandemic. So I actually had like a couple of years to come to terms with it, where life was very autistic friendly, and I think you'll find that's what a lot of autistic people, especially in the UK, will say, thinking about. Obviously, we have to recognize that the pandemic was a really, really challenging time for many people. But for those of us who need a lot of downtime, who need a lot of time away from people, who need very fixed routines, like not being able to leave your house except to do certain things is like the most exact routine you can possibly get. So that was a really, really transformative time for me in a very positive way, because I was able to learn more about myself, and how to look after myself, etc., etc. But going back to your question, I first came across the notion that I might be autistic in Women's Health magazine. So
wow,
it's quite cool, isn't it? It's quite a cool origin story. But I was reading Women's Health magazine, and there was an article in there, a feature that had been written by a late diagnosed autistic woman who, throughout her kind of teenage and young adult years, had been told that she was just anxious, that she was just depressed, they were on medication, and it wasn't until much later on that she discovered that the kind of traits that they had diagnosed that for were actually autistic traits, specifically how it presents in females. I was reading this article and I was just like, that's me, tick, tick. And what was really challenging about that revelation is my mum worked in a special needs school all of my childhood with autistic kids. So we've had conversations about it, and we've been like, why do we think that she never kind of recognized that in me? She was surrounded with it all day. And that was the conclusion that I personally have kind of come to, is that when you are surrounded by it all day, it's normal. And if you come home to it as well, it's normal. And so you don't necessarily think, I shouldn't be coming home to that. That's my theory. Anyway.
No, but that does make sense. It makes a lot of sense, because so outside of what I do with this podcast is I work with adults who have some form of learning disabilities, whether it be mild to profound, and autism is obviously included in that category. And actually I was thinking then, I was like, that is so true, because my day to day is working with disabilities, and then I'm disabled. So then I forget regularly that being disabled and disabilities are not the norm, because they're normal in my life. Like, it's my day to day, it's my lived reality, and it's the people that I work with, it's their lived reality. So when I step out and I'm socializing with friends who aren't disabled, I'm like, oh, that's really weird. Like, I completely forget that, like, I might be the odd one out. I'm like, no, it's you guys, it's not me. So actually that does make a lot of sense. And like, I kind of love the fact that you were reading about it in Women's Health, and that was like, oh, like maybe this is me.
It's just not what you expect, you know. You don't expect to pick up Women's Health and have like a life transformative experience.
Yeah, exactly.
But yeah, so after reading that, I was like, well, what am I going to do about this? And as any autistic person will tell you, the first thing you do is a lot of research. So I did lots and lots of research into being autistic, specifically being autistic as a woman, the kind of like coping mechanisms that autistic people use to deal with, you'll know this really well, you know, like sensory overwhelm, social situations, that kind of stuff. And for a little while, I just implemented those coping mechanisms in my life. So rather than necessarily look for a definitive answer. I wanted to do an experiment on myself, and
to
see if
see like
that,
where you would lie.
exactly. So I did it, and I couldn't believe how much better I felt in myself implementing these things. Like little things, just like getting a pair of ear defenders, so that if the world got too loud, I could put my ear defenders on and not have to deal with it. It's like that can cost, 10-15 pounds, but it can make an incredible difference. And so after a while of implementing these strategies, I was like, right, well, it's clearly really obvious. I am definitely autistic. So I went to the doctor and I presented them with all my research. And I was like, this is why I think I'm autistic. Can I get referred for an assessment? I was incredibly lucky, and I always acknowledge my kind of fortune in this situation, because I got seen within 6 months.
Oh, that's really quick.
Yeah. And I tell people that, and they're like, gosh, that must have been really annoying to have to wait for so long. And I was like, some people can be waiting years, 3 years, 4 years, 5 years, more, just to get seen. And I got seen within 6 months. So
wow.
Then I got my diagnosis, and now it's official. Although I think it's really important to caveat that within the autistic community, we are very open and welcoming to people who self-diagnose, simply because it is so difficult to get access to that formal diagnosis. And it's not hurting anybody, is it? At the end of the day, if you identify with that, and you find that those coping mechanisms and those strategies make a big difference for you, then you want to be in a community of people who understand what it's like. So yeah, it's been a roller coaster experience in every sense of the word, but very rewarding as well.
I love the fact that you were able to be seen so quickly, because I know of a lot of people who have had to wait years and years and years. And a diagnosis for autism isn't easy, and particularly with more awareness surrounding female autism as well, because it presents incredibly differently between males and females. I think that the fact that you got seen so quickly is kind of remarkable, actually. Because nobody really gets seen that quickly. And I can completely understand why, as a community, you accept, and like you're very accepting of the idea of self-diagnosis, because clinical diagnosis can take forever. Especially if you're not a small white boy chucking bricks at the back of a classroom, because they tend to push that through quite quickly to be like, yeah, there's your diagnosis, now in the nicest kind of way, fuck off, like move on.
Absolutely. I think that's the other thing to really acknowledge, is that the support for people, especially for adults, once you get that diagnosis, is non-existent, and you have to find it yourself. You have to find that community yourself. You have to find those, saying things, like getting ear defenders to help me cope with noise, because I'm really noise sensitive. That's not something that a professional ever told me to do. That was something that I researched online, and I saw lots of people who are autistic doing on social media, and I was like, well, if it works for them, maybe it'll work for me.
Honestly, I think it's incredible. But interestingly, because you were diagnosed, and I don't want to say late, because there are people who get diagnosed in their like 40s. What was it like for you growing up, and like with school particularly? Because for you it must have been like challenging, but challenging in a different way, because you don't, obviously I don't know, and I'm completely assuming here, so completely correct me if I'm wrong. But I can imagine, from what I know of autism, is that at school you were either a massively high overachiever, or you always underperformed at some level.
So I fall into the overachiever camp. And it's really funny, because I look back on my childhood, and obviously that is predominantly dominated by, schooling experience and experience with peers and that kind of stuff. And I was pretty miserable. I had a pretty miserable time of it. And I always feel a little bit resentful of that, or a little bit kind of like, basically when I got my diagnosis, one of the first processes I had to go through was grieving, because I had to grieve for the childhood that I'd lost, that I could have had with the right support if I'd got my diagnosis earlier.
It's almost like you've been cheated out of a childhood.
100%. And like, I feel it's really difficult to say that, and I haven't been comfortable saying that for a long time, simply because I don't want, I don't want my family to listen to this and to think that I'm saying negative things about my experience with them. It's more the fact that the overall experience, when you put everything together and the difficulties that were faced, was more negative than positive. But yes, so I was a classic overachiever in school. I always got really good grades. And so it's always interesting for people when I say that I hated school, because they assume that people who are this kind of academic intelligent and who do well academically must love school. They must really enjoy it. And I always go to correct people and I say, I love learning. I absolutely love learning. I still pursue learning every day in my adult life. But the school environment is not built for autistic kids. It's not built for neurodivergent kids. It's just, I'd go as far to say it's like a traumatizing experience, to be perfectly honest.
Well, but that comes back to the whole idea, and it's not an idea, and I only say idea because it's how, like, in my words I'm trying to formulate it, but actually the school system is not set up for neurodivergent brains. And like, as we've already covered, they're like, your brain is set up differently to my brain. So my brain did quite well in school, like didn't necessarily love it all the time, but like I did well. Like, I wasn't necessarily like the top grade. I wasn't also the bottom. I was somewhere in the middle. But that was more because I couldn't be asked, not because I didn't have the talent. Whereas actually, your brain works very differently. So for you, that environment wasn't necessarily like a good one or a safe one, or somewhere where you felt like you could flourish, and you didn't have the support unknowingly. You didn't know that you needed it, but you didn't have the right support in places that was going to make that experience more comfortable for you. It's almost like trying to match colors. So like, I'm a blue person, so I fit into like the blue room, but you're a yellow person, and being in the blue room makes you feel uncomfortable.
Yeah, that's a really good analogy, actually. And I think, there were times when I would run out of the blue room. So, I mean, I was diagnosed with anxiety and depression when I was around, I want to say 15. I had a breakdown. I missed months and months of schooling. And when I went back, they put me, or should I say, they gave me the option of accessing, we called it the bridge in my school. And it was basically a space for people who struggled in lessons to have a safe space to escape to. And that there was never the expectation that you would spend all of your time in there, but it was there for you if there was a particular lesson that you couldn't go back to, or if you were transitioning to coming back to school after a long period of time away, which is what I was doing. And that facility had been there since I joined at 11 years old, but I only accessed it then. And if I'd had access to it the whole time, it would have been a very different story.
Yeah, it would have been a complete game changer for you.
Yeah.
Interestingly, so you got your diagnosis at age 23.
Yeah.
And so that's kind of around about the time, particularly in the UK, where you're kind of like, you just left school, you might have gone to uni, you're now kind of in the working world. And I was wondering, what did your career path, and how did you do what you do now? How did that all kind of accumulate and come together for you?
So when I left university, I went to university and studied theology.
Nice and heavy.
Super niche. And there's not much that you can do with a theology degree from an obvious perspective. I absolutely loved my degree and I really, really enjoyed it. But when I came out, I was like, well, I'm either going to become a priest or a teacher.
Yeah.
And
Yeah.
I'm not personally religious, so I became a teacher. I lasted 4 months.
Okay.
It was awful because not only is the school environment not built for neurodivergent kids, it's not built for neurodivergent teachers either.
Yeah.
And at the time, because this is fresh when I left university, I hadn't even read that women's health article yet.
Yeah.
I had no idea what I was getting myself into, and pretty quickly realized that it was the wrong thing for me.
Yeah.
And after that, I went back to university to do a master's degree, because academics is something that I've always excelled at. So when everything fell apart, I was like, well, I know I can do that. So
Yeah.
I'll go back and do that again. So, and interestingly, so I went to the University of Oxford to do my master's degree.
Oh, just a casual drop there. She's actually really effing clever.
Well, what I was going to say is that the University of Oxford has a lot of autistic people in it.
Yeah.
And I think that will come as no surprise to anybody, because as you kind of referenced earlier in the podcast, when you think about autistic people, you think about the two ends of the spectrum, but I don't like to use that anymore, but we'll go with it because I can't think of anything better right now. In terms of, you think of autistic people who have learning disabilities as well, and who can't access education the same way, and who need support to live, and that kind of thing. And then you think about Rain Man, and you think about autistic people who are incredibly intelligent academically, but have absolutely no street smarts whatsoever. And I fall into that camp. I am academically intelligent, but I've got no street smarts, I've got no common sense, none of that. I get absolutely made fun of by my partner and my family for the fact that my common sense is non-existent. But going into an environment like Oxford was a revelation, because I was surrounded by people like me, either who weren't diagnosed and weren't interested in getting diagnosed because their academic success had led people to accept them. They were just like, oh, he's just a bit quirky, he's a bit eccentric. Like, that's the kind of vibe that you get at Oxford. So it's like normal. He just really loves classics or whatever else that people are doing. Or you get a room full of people who have defined their entire personality by their academic success, and who are actually mental health wise really, really struggling. And then you have that conversation where you're like, because this was when I was exploring that I might be autistic. And so I'd be having conversations with people being like, oh yeah, so this is the reason why I think it. And they'd be like,
I do that too.
That's me, yeah. That as well. So that was a really interesting experience. I really enjoyed my time there, but unfortunately the pandemic hit during my second term. So I had to do my third term, which is when I was writing my dissertation. I moved in with my partner, and that was in lockdown. So I didn't get that full university experience. And that the kind of lockdown period was when I really, as I said before, I really got to know myself better. I really got to know what I need in order to thrive. But also when I threw out the window these notions of I have to do what other people expect of me in order to be successful. And that's when I started really throwing myself into my writing. And that's when I approached my publishers and said, I have an idea for a book and this is what I want to write, and will you publish it? And they said yes. And that's kind of what led to us connecting as well.
And I'd love it if you could talk a bit more about your book and like what it's about, without giving like too much away, if you can.
Of course.
Think like being able to use the pandemic as a positive experience for you is incredible, because so many people did not have that experience with the pandemic. But being able to, like you said, like explore your needs, what helps you thrive during that time, it's like it's invaluable, because it was what, two and a bit years still kind of going on, kind of, so like nearly 3 years of like being able to really fully almost understand yourself on a different level, where you haven't been able to have that before, because actually the world was doing nothing, and you were given that almost like breathing room to find that out, and you know, like you said, start writing and develop what you've developed now.
Exactly. I mean, I think you've really hit the nail on the head with your description there. That breathing room is what I needed, and it's what I'd never had. So for me, I'm very, very lucky that the pandemic was that positive experience for me. And the book that I proposed to my publishers is called The Autistic Guide to Adventure. And it's coming out on the 21st of April 2023. And you can actually pre-order it already in all good bookstores. So that's very, very exciting. But as a kind of taster of what's involved in there, what's in that book, it's a guide, it's a handbook of 35 different activities for autistic young people, children, to access from their own kind of perspective. So we've got everything in there from archery to mudlarking to stargazing to wild swimming, and a little bit in there as well about kind of my experience of being late diagnosed and what that means. And also a little manifesto at the end for people to take away and hopefully sign on to, which is really exciting. But the book came about because growing up, I really struggled to access the outdoors. So I was very fortunate. I had a very outdoorsy family. You know, my grandparents would take us hiking, my parents would take us camping. I did have opportunity to do those things. And I have a younger brother as well who is extremely active and outdoorsy and adventurous. And I grew up really envying him because he could just throw himself into anything. And normally make like a really good job of it as well. And I would look at that and I'd be like, oh, wish I could do that, but there was always some barrier stopping me. And I ended up having the majority of my adventures through the pages of books, which I would highly recommend. I still do that now. However, there's a point where you think, I want to have this in my life. Like, I want to be the person who goes out and does something new, and does something that I never thought I could. And it wasn't until I got my diagnosis that I was like, oh, okay, well, clearly there are sensory issues involved here. Clearly there are social dynamics involved here. And also just being able to access information that very clearly explains from start to finish what happens when you do something, which sounds so basic. But for people who can't make the leap between steps, you need to spell out what happens along the way. And there was no resource like that when I was younger. Because maybe if I'd read that, I would have been like, oh,
makes
that's
sense.
And there was no resource like that when I looked for it. How many years ago was it now? 2020. So I wrote it. That's what they say, isn't it? They're like, if you can't see something that you think you need, or you think other people need.
Well, that's exactly how this came about. So like, I'm completely with you on that train. Like, I think if you can't find it and you want to create it, then you should do it yourself. Big fan of that. Big fan of that.
That's our advice, by the way. All listeners, Allie and Brooke say, if you've got an idea and you don't see anybody else doing it, do it now.
100%. Absolutely 100% with you on that. 100%.
So it's incredibly exciting because it took me 18 months to write from start to finish. And there are interviews in there that I alluded to earlier from a range of fabulous autistic people from all over the world. We've got people from the US, people from New Zealand, and the interviews with them are about their own experiences, because I think, as we've touched on, every autistic person is different, and I can only speak from my own experience. And also, as much as we kind of, what's the right way of saying this? We kind of speak ill of these white, naughty autistic boys who get their diagnosis so easily. But I wouldn't want to exclude them, because they are still part of the community. And they do still struggle. They just get recognized a lot easier than the rest of us. But I wanted to make sure that the book had voices from people from all walks of life and all different experiences as well.
And I think that that's really crucial, the point that you just made about every autistic person being completely different, because that's also true for every disabled person, is that you could have two people with the exact same diagnosis on a piece of paper, and how they relate to, how they talk about, how they feel about how their disability affects their life is going to be completely different, and completely individual to that person. And you're right about, you know, those naughty white boys still do struggle, but they're also still a part of your community. And like, as annoying as they might be, they still need the help too.
Everybody deserves support. And I think what we're talking about when we kind of promote this discourse around Black people being diagnosed less, and females being diagnosed less, and working class people being diagnosed less, it's just to make sure that all voices are heard, rather than to squash the voices that are already there.
Exactly that. Oh, I love that. So I like to ask everyone if they have a piece of advice for a younger version of themselves, so a younger version of Allie, but also for a younger person with the same disability as you. And these don't have to be the same pieces of advice. Don't feel pressured to like homogenize one piece.
I think my advice for my younger self would be to stop pretending to be someone that I'm not. And I think it's almost a universal experience, but I think especially for a lot of autistic females, the reason why we don't get recognized is because we're so good at masking. And for those who aren't aware of what masking is, it's where you watch the people around you and you kind of absorb their mannerisms and the way they speak and the ways they behave in order to make yourself more palatable to wider society. And I mean, I wasn't particularly successful because I got bullied a lot at school. So clearly they were like picking up on the she's not like us kind of vibes. But I was desperately trying for so long. And I would just tell her to give it up. Do you know what I mean? Like, I think I'm so much happier now that I'm true to myself, my interests, even if people think that they're a bit weird, and my just being honest about the way that I think about things and the way that I behave. And don't change yourself for other people, you know, that's the universal piece of advice. But I think my advice for anybody with the same disability as me, especially those in their kind of childhood and teenage years, is try and find the things that make the world easier for you. Because as I said earlier, you know, something as easy as ear defenders can make a phenomenal difference. And that's not the same for everybody, because not every autistic person is noise sensitive. That's just what I struggle with. So I think, my advice would be to just experiment and to try different coping strategies and support mechanisms. And when you find what works, use it every day, because it will make such a big difference to your well-being, your mental health, your happiness.
And I think that finding what works for you, particularly as we're talking about neurodivergence, finding what works for you and finding those coping mechanisms can literally be game-changing for you. it can almost revolutionize what once seemed incredibly difficult to actually a very manageable task. And I think I'm classing myself as non-neurodivergent here, and I'm talking about like the wider sense of community, is that sometimes I think we don't necessarily understand how difficult some things can be, because to us, as we've said, like our brains aren't wired the same. So, you know, not being able to sit in a room full of noisy people, for some people, they won't understand why that is so difficult for someone who is very, very noise sensitive. But actually finding the coping mechanisms, God, that was a bit of a struggle to get out, wasn't
it? Tongue twister.
Finding the coping mechanisms that work for you and being able to use them and implement them, so that things that, like, for me don't seem that difficult, but making them palatable and manageable for you is absolutely revolutionary, because we are in a world that is not set up for disabled people. We are in a world that is not set up for the neurodivergent. We are not set up in a world, realistically, that doesn't cater to the slim white version of people. That is like pretty much where we're at. And so being able to make the world more palatable for you, however that may be, is incredible, because change comes about very, very slowly, and being able to make it change internally is way better than trying to fight the forces to make it change externally. That's not to say that your fight externally isn't valid. It absolutely is valid, but making something work for you internally and making you feel at peace with yourself and with the world is a goddamn step better than trying to put yourself into a situation where you're going to be uncomfortable just for the sake of fitting in to this wider rhetoric that we currently have.
Absolutely. And I think that's such an important point, is that not everybody has to change the world, but everybody can change their own lives. And I think that it's okay to choose to put yourself first. I think that's another thing that's, again, a universal difficulty, but is especially relevant to autistic people trying to just get through every day, is that it's okay to put yourself first. And it's okay if your friends want to hang out and you have to say no because you've spent the whole day in the office surrounded by noisy people and you just need a break. Or it's okay to say to somebody, when something seems really obvious, I'm sorry, I don't understand. You're going to have to take me right back and start again. Because I think, especially as an adult, that is a really difficult conversation to have. When people look at you and they're like, you're a full-grown person, you've got significant life experience. How can you not buy a ticket to get on the bus? And it's like, because nobody's ever shown me. Everyone's always assumed that I know how to. This is just an example, but I mean, it's a good one, because as a teenager, and my parents will vouch for this, I refused to go on the bus anywhere. And I grew up in a rural market town, so the bus was the only way that I was going to get anywhere. So I didn't go anywhere because I never wanted to get on the bus, because that experience of buying a ticket, sitting on the bus, knowing when to get off, knowing what to say to the bus driver as you get off the bus, like, it's these tiny, tiny things that people are like, well, either they say it doesn't matter or they say it's obvious. And neither of those answers are sufficient for an autistic brain to be able to cope with doing that thing.
And it's so interesting as you're talking about like the journey of going, like, you know, buying the ticket, sitting down. I'm thinking like, oh, how good would it be just to go on a day out on a bus? I'm like, oh, how nice would that be? I'm like, oh, I love a good chat with a bus driver, get my ticket, sit down, see who sat next to me. Maybe I'll listen to some music, just pootle along. Like, oh, I'll get off here because I fancy it. I'm like, oh, how nice would that be? And then I'm like, oh, that is not everyone's experience.
No, I'm very envious. That sounds like you have a good relationship with buses.
Oh, that's funny. I like to think that through any form of hardship, if you're able to look back and pick out a positive attribute about yourself, you've probably learned something from that experience. And that is not to say that all hardships are learning curves, but 9 times out of 10 they can be. And I was wondering for you, if you've been through hardship, or like you said, you found childhood quite difficult, have you been able to look back at that time and actually pull out a positive attribute about yourself that upon reflection you're incredibly proud of?
Wow, that's a big one.
It's a good question, isn't it?
It's
And
a
the reason
great
I ask it
question.
is because as disabled people, we're not often given the chance to look back at what we've done and celebrate it, because either your life is about pushing forward and fighting because you're fighting for your own rights, you're fighting for your own needs, or it's kind of given that you will just do something without people realizing the process that it takes for you to be able to do something that is different, and you adapt to what, you know, the non-disabled community would do or how they would do it. So being able to look back and reflect as disabled people about positives is kind of revolutionary, and it almost, in my eyes, it's a massive like F you to society to be like, actually we're just as brilliant as you are, and we can recognize that as well.
Yeah. Do you know what? I think, given the kind of themes that we've been talking about today, one of the things that springs to mind is that I finished all of my education.
Yeah.
So, and again, I think I don't want to kind of, people look at intelligent people, academically intelligent people, and they're like, well, obviously you were going to finish your education because you're really smart and you know, it was easy for you, you breezed through it. And it's no. But I think I want to turn that narrative on its head and say, despite the fact that I am academically intelligent, and despite the fact that I got A's and A stars, it doesn't mean that it wasn't an incredibly difficult journey to get there. And you know, as I mentioned before, I missed months of my GCSEs. I also missed months of my A levels. I also missed months of my first degree, because that whole time I didn't have a diagnosis. I didn't even have an inkling that I was autistic. I didn't have any of the coping mechanisms or strategies I needed to be able to thrive. And yet I didn't drop out. I didn't leave. And I'm not saying that anybody who feels that they have to take that step has done any less. But for me personally, I am proud that I didn't have to do that. It's not even that I didn't have to do that, it's that I chose not to, and I chose to keep going. And despite the fact, and I think this in itself is a revolutionary concept, most of your education has absolutely zero bearing on what you do with the rest of your life. I just want to say that in the public sphere, because there are too many educational institutions who try and tell you from primary school that the grades you get in school are going to determine whether you're a successful human or not. And it's bullshit. It is absolute nonsense.
I think that's probably why, like myself in school, I knew from like, I've always been the way that I am now, but I knew from a really young age that actually geography was never going to help me in like the wider sense of the world. And I knew that, like, I know, to be fair, I loved religious studies. I found it very interesting because I find the way that other people's minds work fascinating. But I always sat at the middle of school. Like, I wasn't a massive top achiever, but I also wasn't bottom. But it's because innately I knew that this was never going to help me when I left school. Like, I knew for a fact that going into maths and learning how to work out the circumference of the circle was never going to help me do taxes. It was never going to help me buy a house. It was never going to help me just be an adult. And I remember being sat in so many classes being like, it's fascinating, interesting stuff, don't get me wrong, but this is not actually going to help me. And like, you know, it's so right. Your education, whilst during that period of time, it kind of is the most important thing in your life because there is nothing really else that you do. But actually, it doesn't determine whether or not you're going to be a success outside of the school environment. And also recognize that actually the school environment, once you leave education, is actually an incredibly bizarre concept. Like, think about your adult life. When was the last time you sat down with a room full of people who were all of similar age to you, being told to be quiet and write notes about a paragraph of literature that actually some guy or woman in their brain made up? That was like my take on English. I was like, what? Like, I don't get me wrong, what he said is wonderful, like really groundbreaking stuff. But this is a really bizarre way to be learning about it, sitting in a classroom, trying to write notes about it when all of our notes are going to be different and all of it's completely subjective.
And 5 years down the line, it'll all be in the bin. Like, you will never see those notes again.
No, exactly.
Yeah, I think looking back on it from my own perspective, I wish that I could have followed that mindset through, because like you, I was in classes recognizing that it was all interesting but essentially useless for a successful adult life. But because academics was the only place I was getting validated, because everywhere else I was weird and I was bullied and whatever else it might have been, I made it, like, I pushed myself and I made it so that that was all that was important to me, was doing well at school and getting good grades. And I think that if I'd chilled out a bit, and gone, you know, as you said, being in the middle of the class is not necessarily about lack of talent. It's about recognizing the situation that you've been put in and the utility of that situation to you. If I could have let go of that need for external validation, which I was at 12, like I was never going to do that. But if I could have done, that would have led to a completely different school experience, because maybe I would have allowed myself to focus on things that I truly cared about, or I would have invested my time in things that made me happy.
Yeah. It's honestly, when you look back at school, it's such a wild experience to look back on. I have a really, really, really strong memory of like a deputy head of one of the schools that I was at, and we were talking about exams. And I remember just being like, what's the point in an exam? Like, I can't understand, why do I need to take this? Because some random is going to mark it and tell me whether I'm good or bad. Like, I innately know that I'm a good person, and I know that I'm like intelligent. I know that I could like fend for myself. So why is it important? And I remember this deputy like looking at me being like, Brooke, these are all completely valid points and I don't have a comeback for it. So just do what you will with that information. And I was like, okay. And that's the problem, because then I felt like I was a bit superior, and I was like, I know something everybody else doesn't know. And that was probably a downfall for me.
Oh my gosh, I love that. That deputy head is a top class human being. I appreciate that honesty. And you know, as a little side tangent, that's another issue that I have with growing up neurodivergent, is that we just need to understand the purpose of doing something to be able to do it. And adults going, because I said so, is going to lead to meltdowns and tantrums, because that doesn't compute. Because I said so is not a reason.
I also agree with that. Like, as someone who needs, well, I don't need to understand how a process works, but like, I need to be able to see the end result. It's like, why should I get an A in my geography test? I know that I'm innately a good person. I know that I'm able to wander around the planet and probably be quite okay. Why do I need to know about an oxbow lake? Didn't really understand that. But I completely agree with your point that someone just being like, because you need to. I was like, no. It
doesn't work like that.
No, but then I was also really gobby, so it's part and parcel of me and my big mouth.
I would have loved to sit in a classroom with you at school, just to observe the chaos.
So it's really funny. I like, obviously part and parcel of what I do is CrossFit. And like a friend of mine who also happens to be a coach is like, I avoid it when you book onto my classes because you just bring chaos. I was like, thank you so much.
I mean, having done a little bit of CrossFit in my time, I feel like you need chaos to get through. Like, I think probably a very positive thing to bring to a CrossFit class.
You know what? I accept it. Like, I'm a chaotic person. My energy is a bit like a storm in a teacup, and I'm small enough to like refer to myself as a teacup as well. I'm basically the same size as a borrower, so.
But that's the thing. That's the thing that we've been talking about. And, you know, the advice that I gave is just be true to yourself and just do what feels right for you. You know, as long as you're not hurting anybody or causing any damage, then be weird, be quirky, be eccentric, be a storm in a teacup, because that's who you are.
And you know what's really interesting is, I think part of the reason that I am so upfront and so like I can be brutally honest and like quite no bullshit, a lot of that is down to the fact that I've always known that I'm disabled, and I've always known that there is if I need help, I need to ask for it, because nobody's going to necessarily give it to me if I can't explain the reasons as to why I need help, or all of this kind of thing. In my head, I was thinking, like, I wonder if Allie got her diagnosis a bit earlier in life, if she would also be the same, because I think you are very who you are, and had you had that diagnosis, Allie, you'd be even more of who you are, just for like a longer period of time.
Exactly. Like, I feel like I am on that journey, and I'm definitely getting to the point where I am that person. Like, part of the reason why I wrote the book was because the difficulty of accessing support is knowing what to ask for and having the confidence to ask for it. And as you said, as somebody who has grown up always knowing that you're disabled and knowing that you're going to have to ask those questions, you progress through that journey quicker. Not necessarily quicker, but you get there quicker, let's say. And you are able to have that confidence because you have no other choice. Whereas for a lot of people who get these late diagnoses, who spent all their lives thinking there's something wrong with me and nothing can be done to fix it and nobody wants to help me, you're absolutely right that you don't get that mindset, you don't develop that mindset. And it's coming up 4 years since I got my diagnosis, and I would definitely say that I'm at the point now where if it was myself or somebody else who needed something that wasn't being offered, I would literally just stand up in the middle of the room and go, excuse me,
I need this,
what is going on?
And I love that for you, because I think it will develop even stronger as time goes on. And that's like, it's kind of wonderful to be like the outspoken person. Like, I do revel in it quite a lot.
I would highly recommend it. Like, honestly, I think that by the time I'm, some people have a midlife crisis. I think I'm going to have midlife empowerment, and I'm just going to become really kick-ass.
I love that. That's like, I think you should maybe trademark that, because I think someone's going to try and steal it.
You heard it here first.
I only have one final question for you, Allie, and I think I know the answer to it, but I'm still going to ask it anyway. And that is, Allie, are you disabled and proud?
100%. And I really hope that listening, not just to this conversation, but the other conversations that you've had on the podcast, are helping other people to also say they're disabled and proud, because you are not a problem, you are not broken, and you are not something to be fixed. You are who you are, and you need to share that with the world, and be proud of yourself.
Exactly that. And that's the whole reason that this podcast was brought about, because I didn't realize that being confident with your disability was not necessarily the norm, because it's always who I've been. And it wasn't until I had a couple of conversations with people who were disabled and weren't necessarily happy about it that it kind of revolutionized my brain. And I just want to say thank you so much for being on this, because what you've spoken about today has been really enlightening for someone who isn't neurodivergent, because how I think and how you think, as we've said multiple times already, is very different. But you being able to explain as to why is really beneficial for someone like me who wants to help other people who are neurodivergent, but I don't necessarily know the best way to do it. So now I feel, at least if I can explain better and I can help understand people's wants and needs, then I can become a better person to help others. And I thank you so much for talking about your experience and giving your time, and also talking about your book. Like, I can't wait to read it.
Thank you. Well, thank you so much for having me. Like, I've had so much fun. I love doing podcast interviews, because it's just like a chat at a sleepover, when you stay up really late and you're like, I'm supposed to be asleep, but also this is too good.
Putting the worlds to rights, as I like to think of it.
Absolutely. And just kind of wrapping up on what you just said, I think for anybody who is wondering, how can I be a better support to a neurodivergent person, the answer is communication. It is genuinely just explain your perspective, because that's the other thing. We've got no idea what's going on in your brains, and your brains are baffling us as well. So two-way communication is so important, to be able to find that meet in the middle place. That's really going to make the difference.
Oh, well, like I said, thank you so much for giving me the time to being on the pod today. I've loved it, and I can't wait to read your book. I'm so excited for you. So excited.
Oh, thank you. I'm mildly terrified for people to read my book, but excited as well.
Yeah, for sure. Well, thank you so much for coming on, and we'll speak soon.
Absolutely.